on. Hi everyone, welcome to the panel on driving carbon removals for people, nature, and the planet, where we'll be talking about landscape level nature-based solutions and commodity supply chains. I'm Allison Owens, and I work for an organization called CURE, where I lead our work on carbon and climate frameworks. At CURE, we've been developing nature-based solutions projects within commodity supply chains for the past 17 years in 20 countries across the world, spanning both tropical and temperate ecosystems. I think Monday morning on week 2 is a little bit of a tough session because people are tired and everybody's heard a lot over the past week or so. So I'm going to do my best to kind of situate this discussion in the context of everything that's happened so far at COP, and then, kind of looking towards the future. And obviously, we are here at the CDR 30 Pavilion, so talking about how we can really drive sustainable demand for renewables into 2030, and thus supply can match. So I think all of us have probably heard this be referred to as the implementation COP at this point, and I've also heard it referred to as the COP of Forest, which I like. And we're obviously sitting here in the Amazon region of Brazil, which reminds us of the interconnectedness really between climate, people, and nature, and the fact that people really are at the heart of what we're doing to fight the climate crisis, and we need all of these systems to work together in order to really make the change that we need to see. And so everybody here also would agree that we do need to scale high integrity carbon removals while at the same time stopping deforestation in order to make progress towards climate change at the pace that we need to. And today in the CDR space, let's say, I do think nature is the most scalable and widely understood technology that we have. And so that's why we're going to talk about MBS removals specifically in agricultural supply chains today, because they represent a huge opportunity and really sit at the heart of connecting people, nature, and climate. All of us eat food every day. We need food to survive, and agricultural emissions are also responsible for about 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions each year across the world. And so really, I think what interventions within agricultural supply chains represent is kind of like a quadruple bottom line, if you want to use ESG terminology, because you can not only generate high quality carbon removals within the interventions, but you can also increase biodiversity, you can enhance supply chain resilience, and you can improve farmer livelihoods. And I was at a panel this past week where somebody was talking about how do we drive finance into carbon projects, and one of the things they talked about was having multiple revenue streams. And I think when you're doing nature-based solutions in supply chain landscapes, you really get at that question of driving many different outcomes that generate many different types of revenue potentially. So I think one of the core challenges that I have heard since being here in Brazil is just the need to mobilize finance at scale. There is finance out there, both in the public and private sectors. And then there's also, obviously, people who are doing work on the ground who are looking for finance, and sometimes the connections between those two things don't always link up in a way that we're able to scale these solutions. And so I want to take the opportunity today to kind of discuss some of the barriers and opportunities that exist in that landscape to really scale these interventions, and how to make capital flow. And I think a couple of the topics we're going to talk about related to policy and MRV, and how those can play a role in providing certainty and assurance and de-risking investments. I've also personally, we work a lot in agroforestry and coffee and cocoa supply chains, and I've personally heard from some numerous actors here, including Amazon. They're interested in investing in agroforestry because of where it sits in this landscape, really touching kind of the human and nature dimensions as well, in addition to making progress towards climate. I think we can all agree that the unit of transaction here and why it's relevant that we're here in the CDR 30 Pavilion is typically carbon. That's what's driving the most investment. But underlying that is the impacts on the natural environment and on people, and that's really what we're trying to maximize. So with that, if each of you could maybe start with just an introduction to you, your organization, and a brief summary of how it leads this conversation, and then after that we'll get into the panel questions.
No, there we go. Hi everyone. I'm Alan Kroger, Director of Nature, Climate, and Satelligence. How we fit into this space is that we use satellite data and ground data to then basically look at how is above-ground biomass changing within forests, within commodity systems, within landscapes, and within farms, so that you can have the confidence to understand your baseline, but also what progress you're making in terms of when you're investing in agroforestry, when you're investing in understanding where is there opportunity to increase carbon removals. This type of technology enables you to identify those opportunities at scale, measure progress at scale, look at reversal risk at scale, again, to basically be able to not just look at small projects in the carbon removal space, but actually to be able to look at whole landscapes, whole supply chains to drive investments in this nature-based removal space.
Thank you, Alison. Good morning. My name is Pauline. I'm the climate lead at Proforest. We're a global organization that works on sustainability in agricultural supply chains, and we do this throughout the whole supply chain. So I would say that how our work links to nature-based removals is through many of the things that we champion with companies in our consultancy work, as well as in our landscape work, which are multi-stakeholder initiatives in territories to drive sustainable agricultural production. And we work on combating deforestation and conversion. We work on regenerative agriculture. We work on forest restoration, and all of these things, of course, contribute to carbon storage and biomass and soil. So yeah, I think that's the high level of it. I'd like to get into it in the panel too. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Carmen. I come from Silvera, the carbon data provider. So at Silvera, we offer carbon data both on the demand and supply side, and we do ratings. That's our main expertise, and our main offering is where the company started. And of course, we have ratings for removals, including MBS. I think that when it comes to removals in the nature space, ratings play a very important role, especially on demonstrating permanence. And the idea is that clients can take informed decisions about what they buy and the price that they pay based on the quality of those carbon credits. I work in the policy team, specialized in jurisdictional road class, but very linked to also as well like the nature space in general and agriculture specifically.
Thank you. Okay, so first question is for you, Pauline. It's about what, in terms of the clients that Proforest works with and just your knowledge of the market more broadly, what is driving demand for nature-based removals in the market today, and how do you think co-benefits for people and ecosystems are influencing the types of investments that companies are making?
Thank you. So for a bit of context, we work with a wide range of clients. We work with downstream companies, including Nestle, McDonald's, PepsiCo, and a range more, as well as upstream companies. I'm based in Brazil, so we work with sugarcane suppliers, we work with soy traders, with meat packers. So the way that they interact with nature-based removals changes a lot. When we look at our downstream clients, which is where my expertise lies, let's say, these nature-based removals, the demand for them are very much driven by their net zero targets. So it's there within the supply chain, food, land, and agricultural emissions, flag emissions, that drive their demand for those removals. Now, I think it's very important that it's not the same for the upstream companies that we work with. There we see that what they've mostly heard about in Brazil is carbon credits, it's offsetting, it's compensating their emissions. So we're kind of working on how do we match those two narratives, how do we match those two interpretations of what carbon benefits can be used for, because we know, working with these downstream companies, that they are currently not very interested in carbon credits because it's not allowed to compensate your emissions within your supply chain. You can discuss if there should be in complex supply chains a way to do so, maybe we will later today, but I'll keep off that topic for now. Now, I see a lot of opportunity in focusing on nature-based removals for decarbonizing your supply chains. We still need reductions, but for example, in Brazil, we already have very technologically advanced agriculture, for example, in soy, for example, in sugarcane. Sugarcane is their own national program. Who's not familiar with that? It's called Renova Bio. It is already driving down emissions because it provides a direct revenue to the sugarcane mill. So I would say in the Brazilian sector, one of the largest potential, if it's not switching diesel for biodiesel, because we have a huge production, it is nature-based removals. And as you already mentioned in your introduction, this also helps with other ESG goals such as nature, such as adaptation. It's really a win-win. Now, that being said, there are also a lot of challenges when it comes to accounting for those removals. Recently we had a workshop here in Sao Paulo to discuss with some of the main banks and companies that have set SBTI targets, including SBTI, about the challenges to account for the good things that are happening in Brazilian agriculture. And the main thing that came up was removals. And that's removal in degraded pastures. So we have a national target of 40, if I'm not mistaken, 40 million, restoration of 40 million hectares of degraded pasture. It's called Raiz or Greenways or Caminho Verde. They keep changing it, I get confused. But it's a huge target. Now, to measure carbon in soil, it's a huge operation. It's very expensive. So what came up most, specifically from meat packers, is how can we prioritize our resources such that we can still implement and MRV isn't too expensive to make that the claim viable. So I would say that's one of the biggest challenges. Then there's other concepts like for life, where your removal needs to be as long, the permanence needs to be as long as your emission, which in many cases for nature-based removals makes them unviable because it's 1,000 years. How will you make a contract with your supplier to have a forest up for 1,000 years? You don't even know who will be around by that time. And the other one is that keeps coming up, it's carbon opportunity cost. What do you compare your current production with? What's the difference in the carbon that would have been there if there was no human interaction at any point, which is of course a huge difference. So I would say that those three things, the need for proxies to estimate how much movement is happening and kind of flexibilizing that at requirement, very strict requirement on MRV. I'd love to hear from you on this as well. Secondly, and is to methodological concepts like for like and opportunity cost. I'm sorry to get down into the methodological details, but they're very technical, but they're also very strategic. And I'll add to that the last one, which is, for example, areas of permanent preservation and legal reserve in Brazil. These need to be forested by law, but there's a 20 million hectare deficit. 20 million, that's a huge deficit. We want the companies that we work with to invest in those areas and make the claims as they see fit towards their goals, but the current guidance makes that more difficult. So our main goal is nature-based removals, the things that we do on the ground that we see that work. How can we make sure that the carbon credit market as well as the insetting market contributes to those positive outcomes?
Right, yeah, I think those are some really good points, especially about how complicated the claims landscape still is today. I think with the lack of certainty in the claims landscape, that obviously hinders investment from happening, and different types of companies in different geographies have different goals and different strategies, which is also complicated. And then a little bit to the policy question, there's initiatives across the private sector and public sector, and today I don't think we're seeing a lot of these things talking to each other. I mean, that's a lot of why we're here at COP, right, is trying to square those things up and make public and private sectors work together. And so kind of on that topic, I will turn to you, Carmen, and just let you talk about the evolving regulatory and policy landscape and many of these geographies that we're talking about, specifically, in tropical ecosystems where there's a lot of potential to implement NBS in commodity supply chains, and how you think that is, helping or hindering demand for these types of interventions.
Thank you so much, Alison. In terms of regulations, I think that they are the main driver for demand for carbon removals. Obviously, carbon removal is kind of like born in the voluntary space. If you look at the history of carbon markets, you have the CDM with very, very few projects, basically issuing removal credits, like forestation. So it started there, but I think that if we want to scale, if we want really a lot of finance to be flowing to carbon removals, that needs to come from obligations, from policies. So there are two types of policies mainly that will drive demand for carbon removals. One are reporting policies, like the one that we have in the EU, the CSRD. And the other type of policies that I think that is really important is carbon pricing compliance systems, ETSs or carbon taxes that allow to meet certain parts of the obligations, if not all, with the use of carbon credits. So maybe focusing first on reporting and transparency. As you know, there is these regulations coming mainly in Europe, but also in other places that are guiding companies on the procurement strategies. Many of them are impacting companies a lot in the sense that they are forcing them to think about their Paris-aligned targets and to think about neutralization and to think about how to achieve net zero. So if not making it mandatory, they are speeding up kind of like the process of getting companies to think about how to meet their net zero targets. And when it comes to compliance carbon pricing systems, we are seeing a massive wave of systems making carbon credits eligible, especially in those countries that they have a potential for MBS projects or other type of projects. And when it comes to removals, we have the examples of the EU. They are planning to allow CRCF or like removals under the EU standard to be used towards compliance. So I think that this can play a massive role in driving demand. I wanted to mention that despite policy being the main kind of like trigger catalyzing instrument for carbon removals investments, there are other initiatives that have been ruling the carbon markets, especially the BCM, like the SBTI, that also have a key role to play. We have had like a new draft coming in last week, I think it was, right? Being a little bit more optimistic about the use of carbon credits, and that can make a massive difference. And I think that overall, everything comes to regulatory clarity. Companies cannot make a strategy and they are not gonna basically invest if they don't have clarity both on the demand but also on the supply side. So I think that I have covered the demand side, kind of like what can you use the credit for, what are the obligations that you have, but I wanted to say that the supply side is also extremely important. We have a lot of host countries developing regulation related to Article 6, also to all the rest of the carbon markets because they are extremely interlinked. And if we don't have clarity about ownership rights, trading regulations, and the list actually goes on and is really long, we are not going to basically unlock finance for carbon removals.
Great. Thank you. Super clear there on some of the issues that persist. I think, one thing I've been thinking about is how companies are making investments and the types of claims that they can make, which is obviously very linked to their scope 3, and there's rules governing what counts within a company's scope 3. But then at the same time, we really need to see this broader landscape level action. So maybe Alan or Colleen, you can talk a little bit about the importance of landscape level action, and then we can talk about the kind of MRV systems that we can use to ensure integrity across landscapes.
Yeah, sure. I can start. I know that you guys do a ton on landscapes too. But yeah, I think the blocker in terms of so lots of companies are investing in landscape programs. They're setting up new landscape programs. They're finding NGOs to partner with on landscapes. But the thing that slows down, I think, increased levels of finance to do bigger, better things there are because the clarity on how they can claim those benefits from a landscape are still quite lacking, or at least how they can connect them to their own supply chain and connect them to the commercial spaces. But the importance for companies that we see in that space is that we're not just monitoring deforestation and land use change emissions and removals on their concessions or on their plots that these companies are sourcing cocoa, coffee, palm from. They see the landscapes as these commodities are still, most of them still are expanding through a model of extensification and not intensification. And so when you're sourcing, cocoa from Nigeria, or you're sourcing, soy from Brazil or other places, it's expanding into landscapes where it already has it's already present, but it's expanding in order to meet their the rising demand for that. And so the emissions taking place at the landscape level are the future scope 3 emissions of the companies as they improve their traceability data. So even though you may be only buying from your direct farms for cocoa in this part of Nigeria, but then landscape overall, cocoa is expanding now. And so when you buy more cocoa from that area in Nigeria 5 years from now, when it comes into production, that becomes your locked-in emissions. So as a company, if you invest in a landscape and you're proactive in a landscape on reducing the deforestation driven by the commodity that you're already buying there, then you can reduce your future liability for the emissions connected to that commodity. So that's a big part of what we help companies see and be proactive about.
And do you think maybe just as a follow-on that messaging is really resonating with companies today? Because I know the companies that we work with, at least, you see a wide variation in the level of education among sustainability teams in terms of what their strategies are, how they're going to meet targets, et cetera. And I don't know that everybody is is thinking at the landscape level in that critical way?
I would say all of the companies that are not laggards in the space, they're not just concerned about compliance. They have a science-based target. If you have a science-based target, then every sustainability person I talk to, the different traders, CPGs, they all understand that landscapes are a part of managing risk and managing supply chain resilience and security of supply, and not just security of supply from a volume perspective, but security of supply that is compliant in the future when it comes to EUDR, but also then won't completely derail their science-based target progress that they've already made in their direct supply. And so if they're not proactive about where these commodities are expanding now in those land, then if they're not already proactive there, then they then have to go backwards essentially with their targets.
You want to know?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with a bit of background also on what are landscape initiatives, because not everybody in the room might call it that. But before I do that, it's something that we changed in our language on that more recently. We always used to talk about landscapes as beyond supply chain. We even have we have a responsible sourcing production team. I'm on that, and then we have a beyond value chain team. We're completely stepping away from that because we understood that that's not helpful. It's not beyond supply chain. The landscapes where your production comes from, they're within your supply chain. So it wasn't a helpful narrative. It kind of made companies think about the landscapes as if it were carbon credits. It's compensating your impact. No, actually, they're the landscapes that your products come from, where your producers work, where oftentimes your first aggregator is processing your product. So we feel that it should be very intentionally used as something that is used to transform your own scope 3. It's not beyond that. Now a landscape, for those that are a bit less familiar, we describe them as multi-stakeholders initiatives within production landscapes driving sustainable production of commodities. So it includes a range of implementation actions. It's combating deforestation conversion, regenerative agriculture, human rights due diligence, and so much more. But I think the key piece in landscapes that sets it apart is the governance element, which is very hard to put a KPI on, but I think it's key, especially if we're talking about within a landscape, offsetting, insetting, payments for ecosystem services. I think the governance piece and the avoidance of double counting and how do we nest all of that together, it's really a key element that we're struggling with, honestly, in Brazil, because one actor is a carbon credit expert, the other one is an inset expert, the other one is just delivering the plants to the farmer, and they can't really think of that. They don't have time to think about the level of governance needed to put them all together. So maybe to not only look at it in a negative sense, I see that there's a lot of potential for landscapes. We already have a big portfolio. One of the platforms that you can access is called SourceUp, that has a set of landscape initiatives and their characteristics and what they are working on. And we see a lot of potential for those projects to be included towards flag targets. And we're working with SBTi, with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to ensure that the carbon benefits that stem from those initiatives are also accounted for. I won't go on a technical rant again. There's a lot to it. But yeah, I'm glad that we're all working together also with Satelligence and Proforest to make that happen.
Definitely, I think that speaks to the importance of multi-stakeholder coalitions and actors working together in the landscapes in a pre-competitive manner or whatever. Sometimes, obviously, when it comes to private companies, it can get a little bit complicated. Do you have an example, maybe, of a successful landscape level initiative that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. I'm gonna go with the Brazilian example. I'm based in Brazil. Apologies. There's many others, but. We have one that we're engaged in together with IPAM, Produção Certo, and the PCI Institute, and that's in Western Mato Grosso. So if I'm not mistaken, it's 6 municipalities. The focus there is really on producing more sustainably, conserving, so a lot of excess forest is being paid for, payments for ecosystem services towards the conservation of that forest that could still legally be deforested, as well as inclusion. So produce, P, conserve, C, and then include, I. And it's a very successful strategy at the state level, actually, that is now being implemented and piloted in certain municipalities as to see how that can really be brought to the ground and how those benefits can also be distributed. And I think that will become very important when we start looking at J-rent, for example. We know that the state of Mato Grosso is also on that path towards setting that up. And we see a lot of potential in really getting those benefits and those actions to the ground.
And are there claims coming out of that project? Could you share how the claims landscape looks?
Yes, claims, very much so. Carbon claims, not so much. I'll try to keep my answer short. We are working on something that's called a blueprint. So that's trying to set out what are the different phases that a landscape goes through, because first you need to improve the readiness of the landscape to actually receive the resources and the implementation, as well as a set of indicators that helps companies to make claims at the landscape level, because there's a lot of actors that are involved. Normally it's multi-stakeholder, it's public, it's private, it's NGOs, the ideal is that many actors are involved, which makes claims more difficult. Now, for carbon, we did do a study, and I can share the report if that's of interest. We did do a study upon, I kind of call it a supply and demand study, because on the one hand, we looked at, okay, what carbon is the landscape providing? So on conservation, restoration, regen ag, how much CO2 equivalent is being reduced and being removed? And on the other hand, we looked at demand. Okay, insetting, carbon credits on the voluntary market, carbon credits on the regulatory market, payments for ecosystem services, RenovaBio that I already mentioned today, all of these, what's the willingness to pay? And what is needed? What is the methodological challenge? What are the methodological challenges to account for those? And then we looked at, okay, how do we match them together? So the price of implementation is this much. The willingness to pay of the company or the public actor is this much. And what that showed, and it was no surprise whatsoever, is that we need a mix of instruments within one landscape. It's not just going to be carbon credits. It's not just going to be RenovaBio. We also need to look towards insetting, payments for ecosystem services, and how, again, going to the nesting piece, how do we put them all together? So it's a difficult nut to crack, I would say, but I'm glad to say that finally we're seeing some momentum from companies putting money towards figuring out how that monitoring could work within the landscape. Also some more openness from SBTi, as we were saying, to look at activity pool level mitigation, indirect mitigation, compensating your ongoing emissions. So I see it going in the right direction, but the answer right now, we don't have. We need to do the work. We need to put in the work to figure out what could be the best configuration of those claims.
No, I think that's a perfect example of the landscape, not actual landscape, but the landscape that many of us are working in, where there has to be this interoperability between the types of assets being produced, the types of claims being made, and clarity for companies on what they can do with those, and that really doesn't exist today, and I think it's a huge hindrance to kind of the demand question we're asking. And one of the things you brought up is about methodologies, and obviously for each of these types of assets, there are many corresponding methodologies that one can use to quantify the carbon itself. And as we all know with the voluntary carbon market, a lot of the integrity concerns have been about whether a carbon credit is really sequestering or producing a ton of CO2. Maybe Alan, you could talk a little bit more about the MRD landscape today, what companies are looking for. I know I've heard a lot from investors over the past week that one of the things they're looking for in terms of de-risking investments is basically real-time data on these projects, what's happening on the ground, what the carbon numbers look like. Then of course there's also the whole data landscape for nature and social outcomes as well that people who invest in these projects are really interested in. So maybe from a intelligence perspective, you can provide a little bit more insight on what kind of the latest and greatest in the MRB world is looking like.
Yeah, so the real-time data is what they're looking for. It's not the sort of this usual annual reporting of looking back. They want to know what's happening right now. Actually, so most of the finance sessions that I've been part of this week are really talking about getting real-time data on risk of reversals in their investments. So when they're investing across multiple jurisdictions across the world, they want to be able to see relative risk across all of them so that their investments and risk across them are all comparable on a global basis. And then to be able to see essentially in relative real time what type of land use change risks are actively occurring, so that they can reach out to the partners on the ground, other parties, to then stop that reversal that could then scale from there, and basically is reducing the value of the asset. And then they're also looking for not just that land use change reversal risk piece, but also the more acute measurement of the actual size of the biomass assets. So, now with the satellite data, the last few years have been huge advances in terms of the ability to measure on a pixel by pixel basis, down to basically every 0.1 hectares of the world. You can see how tall the trees are, how much biomass is locked up in them, and then with the right modeling and the ground data combined with that, you can then measure the actual fluctuations on a relative real-time basis of how are biomass levels changing in this forest, in this part of your investment versus this part of the forest. And then you can also see from an opportunity and investment screening perspective, the banks and then the food and ag companies themselves, they can then see where is the biomass density higher in this part of my supply chain versus lower in this part, which then represents this is a conservation opportunity to maintain carbon stocks, and then this is an opportunity to invest in agroforestry, reforestation, assisted natural regeneration, to then improve those carbon stocks through removals-based investments in the nature space. So we'd be curious how you're thinking about how the methodologies are matching up with the technology suite.
Yeah, maybe I can comment a little bit on that. I mean, data is the base of everything, really, like having that transparency and having all the information to actually take informed decisions. And I think that, you mentioned risk of reversals, and I think that one of the things that I could add to that is that dedicated insurance products are really important. I think that, we won't find or very few MBS removal projects, right, that don't have some risk of reversal there. So it's just a matter of finding instruments to kind of compensate for that and overcome that. And I think that maybe there is not that many options out there. And I think that data can be also very important and useful for insurance products to, develop something that matches the need.
Okay, great. I'll chime in as well. I'm kind of curious to hear from you how you see improving technology reducing the cost of MRV. And the reason why I'm asking is because we know that satellite monitoring for biomass sequestration, I think it's also already quite evolved. But really in Brazil, the focus and the huge challenge is soil removal. So sequestering carbon into the soil, for example, by restoring degraded pasture. And I think the main lens that we're putting to that is how do we avoid supplier fatigue and a huge amount of work for small-scale producers to do to prove basically that they're doing these removals. So we're talking about the evolving technology space. How do you see that? Do you see that going in the right direction? Will we have more money for implementation, basically?
I certainly hope so. I think it really relies on, in my opinion, it relies on the methodologies catching up with the technology. Because right now, so like in the removal space with agroforestry, just for them to talk about soil in a second, it's quite different in terms of the level of activity on the ground that it requires. But like in agroforestry, or even in reforestation projects, like the cost of setting up the initial ground survey to collect the primary data that you need to then calibrate the satellite data interpretation, which then does the MRV going forward, like that to do a big campaign, is low mid six figures to do that. But then you can use that data to calibrate the satellite, the remote sensing component of this, and then you can measure your removals from that for 5 years, remotely only, and you can get a pretty good accuracy on that with the primary data that's collected using the survey design, and so that itself, then tons of money can then go into the implementation and scaling those projects everywhere else. The same is true with like SOC-based projects. We still have to do, I think, way more sampling when it comes to the soil carbon-based project versus the ARR-based projects. just because of the sheer variability in the levels of SOC in just even in one pasture next to the other, even if it's the same soil type. And I think also the variability of like how SOC migrates in the soil horizons is also like something more complicated that you can't see via satellite, at least not with good enough accuracy to make claims on it. It's like if you're measuring from 0 to 30 horizon or 0 to 50 centimeter horizon, fine, but then your SOC might migrate down to the 50 to 100 centimeters, and if you're not measuring that, we think you've lost soil carbon, when in reality it's just moved to a more permanent horizon. So satellite data can't solve that. But in terms of like the practice-based accounting, you can go and do good measurements of the SOC levels, associate them with activity-based interventions, and it can be a data accounting. So something simple like no-till. So that you can see via satellite, very straightforward, whether someone is continuing or they've adopted a no-till practice, and whether they've continued that no-till practice. And same with cover crops too. Like you can see the signature is specific to the crops. So you can see if someone has planted, maize, soy, and then some other cover crop that they're supposed to as part of the SOC benefits. You can see that, and you can track it dynamically if they've done it, and then the area of coverage, and use that to multiply against the soil carbon benefits from the models.
Great answer. I think SOC is one of the more complicated emerging topics. So thanks for bringing that into the conversation. And there's a lot of emerging technologies I think that are aimed at reducing the number of samples and reducing costs, but still it remains a pretty costly proposition for most companies to engage in modeling in the landscapes that they're working in. Maybe just to kind of zoom out a little bit on the beyond carbon dimension. I think we focused a lot on carbon, but whoever wants to take this, talking a little bit about like in the permanence landscape, the importance of having those social and nature co-benefits really built into projects. From an MRV perspective, ensuring that we're measuring these outcomes, the types of maybe not claims is the right word, but the types of data points that companies have been interested in from a social and nature perspective, and just kind of like building and designing really holistic interventions that are centering people and nature at the heart of them, not just the carbon removal.
I can maybe quickly comment on that. So as I mentioned earlier, we do carbon credit ratings, right? So we assess the project, and we assess all the carbon side of things, additionality, performance, leakage, but then we also have an important pillar that is co-benefits and safeguards. And I think that the buyers have become more sophisticated in this aspect. I think that initially they would talk about the sustainable development goals and co-benefits, and now they are FPIC and all these like safeguards that are extremely important. So I think that has been like a good shift. And I think that they are interested in this, not only because it's the right thing to do or to ensure that there is no net harm, but because they can play a very important role in ensuring delivery of carbon credits. I think that if you don't include communities, if you don't get their buy-in, you actually have a massive risk of the credits never being delivered. So I think that, the interest in this is twofold. Right thing to do, but also is kind of like the safest thing to do in terms of like the investor or the buyer of a carbon credit.
Yeah, I think especially in the insetting space, we have seen a lot less focus on that. And I didn't come up with this, but I really like the people that say that instead of co-benefits, it should be core benefits. And especially if you talk to a farmer, it is the core benefit. It's their financial gain, it is nature, it is people, it is not carbon. So I think this translation of what you talk about, depending on the actor or the level upstream you are in the supply chain, is very important. Specifically on people and nature, I think those are two of the principles that we are championing as high integrity insetting principles, together with Conservation International, the international platform for insetting, and a bunch of the people in the room actually. So great to see you here. And basically what we're trying to do is this narrative on people and nature. I think it's already been very strongly discussed and criticized in the carbon credit space. And in insetting, we really want to make sure that we use this momentum that we have behind SBTi flag targets to use it to its full potential. So how can we leverage these climate targets for positive impact on the ground? How do we avoid that all of the resources are being funneled into traceability and MRV only? We need that for accountability, but we also need to make sure that there's money left over to make the changes that we are aiming for within these target setting frameworks. So you're all invited to have a look. There's a great call to action at Conservation International lab, so high integrity insetting, and we do hope to take that forward. And just to give one example of the things that we're looking at, we don't want to make it harder to do insetting, please. No, it's already hard enough. There's so many methodological limitations. But what we do want is continuous improvement of what an insetting project looks like. When we talk to our clients and how their carbon calculators, as I call them, recommend to implement their flag targets, oftentimes one of the first things that is being looked at is switching your supplier or your recipe or your ingredient or your region. And what we're trying to promote as much as possible, that can be a last resort if you didn't manage to engage them after a few years, which is most often the time that is needed. How do you engage them and develop something together? So we're looking at maybe setting up a scorecard of an insetting project. Okay, what's the minimum level? Okay, it's carbon focused, but how do we also acknowledge and help evaluate how the people and nature components are being implemented within a project? And maybe, very important, a lot already exists in the carbon credit, the offsetting space. What can we learn from them, from their mistakes and from their successes?
Yeah, so just one of the other elements that we're looking at when it comes to the areas of carbon removal opportunities for companies, a lot of it's around agroforestry with cocoa and coffee companies. But one of the things that's been really nice that we've been able to combine with this, so you can not only just identify via satellite what are the farms that have the largest carbon removal opportunities in terms of like where you have full sun cocoa, full sun coffee that can then be converted. So we can show them, okay, these are the farms that have a 40-ton gap that they can then claim those benefits over the next 10 to 15 years. But we can show them which farms and which clusters of farms where that if you were to implement agroforestry here, it would connect forest patches. It would also increase both the microclimate resilience on those farms because they're in areas of existing climate stress, or they're in areas that are projected in the next 10 years, next 30 years to be in areas of transformation, where they're technically the different models in West Africa say that these are areas not well suited for cocoa in the next 20 to 30 years, but then they can at least use that modeling to understand, okay, if I want to extend the life of that farm, extend the life of that whole producer group, I can target them for agroforestry, for the productivity benefits that it brings, the resilience benefits that it brings, and it also happens to, we did this with one company last year, where we showed with a collection of about 1,500 farms that were able to create a habitat corridor between the Tai National Park and the forests over in Liberia. And so that ends up being able to create biodiversity benefits, not just on the farm level, but also in a supply shed level too.
Let me just quickly comment on that. I think you used a very key word that we're seeing come up more and more in company strategy as well, which is resilience. So it gives me a little bit of hope that this link between people, nature, climate mitigation and adaptation is also becoming stronger within companies. I would say the one risk that we see is that supply chain resilience doesn't equal production landscape resilience. The focus will be on securing supply because that's what procurement teams focus on. Now, I think it's up to us as well in the social aspect of things to keep raising what is resilience for workers, what is resilience for local communities, what is resilience for small-scale producers. I think resilience is very much promoting also a landscape level approach because resilience is not made at the farm level, it's really made at the landscape level. We need to work all together to make sure that we can keep living in these production landscapes. So I see it going the right direction, and I think we need to use this leverage also really start to integrate the people, nature, and climate pillars more within corporate strategy.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a great way to sum up the discussion and why there's such a huge opportunity here is because it's the intersection of all of these different elements. And as I kind of started with from like a financing perspective, it's important to have multiple streams of income, and I mean for companies sourcing from these landscapes, having more resilient supply chains is critical to ensuring that they're able to continue to do the work that they do and source the commodities that they rely on. Before we get to the Q&A portion of the panel, maybe just kind of one closing question. Since we are here at the CDR 30 Pavilion, what do you think success looks like for nature-based carbon removals by 2030? And maybe you can talk about barriers and opportunities from a technical, financial, or policy perspective.
I want to see all of my cocoa and coffee clients investing in agroforestry and not using the word pilot anymore.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that for me it would be kind of like the definition of what good looks like. I think the private sector is extremely confused, and I understand why, because there's so many people trying to define quality, and especially when it comes to removals and to reversals, permanence and whatnot, right? We have like Article 6.4 negotiations, a really, really controversial removal, permanence and reversal risk standard, kind of like not having alignment at all at that level doesn't create confidence in the market, doesn't trickle down well. So I think that for me, and we don't have that many years to 2030 really, would be to have alignment on that, to kind of like create confidence in removals and unlock the market really, at least from a carbon credit market perspective.
I think what I'd like to see is ensuring that producer countries are part of the conversation. So Proforest, we are in Brazil, as I already mentioned. We also work in Indonesia, Malaysia, we have people on the ground in Mexico, Colombia, Ghana. And especially carbon credits, I'm not as familiar, but as BCI, we know that they are not able, or they might not be capacitated to be a part of those methodological conversations. But very much they're also having it very hard to be a part of these groups. They apply and they're not accepted. And we see that the representation of the Global South is rather low, and I think that skews the methodologies towards something that might not work in tropical regions. So for me as a national, but then we're kind of seeing it as a pilot, the priority is listening to those that will really implement Scope 3, and also listening to what's already happening that's good, and learning with that. So I think that would be my key, what I'd like to see into the future.
Thank you all. With that, can we open up to audience questions? Hi. I was wondering, sure, I'm Stanford, I'm the Accountability Framework Initiative and Rainforest Alliance. I feel like all of a sudden we're hearing a lot about JRED, so jurisdictional red, plus, and I would love to hear thoughts on how that fits in with this conversation, either within supply chains or outside of supply chains. Like, where do you see those two conversations connected?
Okay, so again, like, kind of like from my expertise in carbon markets, I'm not close to the supply chain specifically, but JRED can bring a lot of opportunities, a lot of volume, and a lot of guidance, but also they create a lot of confusion in terms of other individual activities that are happening on the ground, overlap and whatnot. So I think that's something really important and very important for host countries to deal with. It's about providing clarity on how different things in the same place coexist. At the moment, there is a lot of confusion about nesting frameworks and how you actually reconcile carbon accounting between individual projects and jurisdictional projects. You have at the individual level different methodologies from Verras, El Carbono, ERS, Virtual Earth, many methodologies that actually have diverse accounting systems, and then at the jurisdictional level you encounter something actually similar. There is different data sets and different methodologies, so it's extremely complicated. And when it comes to the agri-sector, even more, I think that at the moment this is not covered, and methodologies are not requiring countries or jurisdictions to actually explain much about how to deal with that, and clarity is not helpful. So yeah, I have more a complaint than a solution to respond to your question, but yeah, at the moment it's not looking great.
I can just say that while I agree that it's confusing and bothersome for a lot of companies to understand. And I do think that, so back when 2017, when the Cocoa and Forest Initiative came about, so in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, there was a lot of very productive conversations between like the World Bank, the CPF folks, all of the cocoa and chocolate companies that are invested in those landscapes that just happen to be turned into jurisdictional RED programs. And there was then a lot of synergies identified between what the companies are doing on the ground in their own supply chains with what the governments wanted to do in the overall landscapes. So then a lot of co-financing opportunities were identified, especially in agroforestry with performance-based payments for the tree planting efforts. And if successful as part of the JRED readiness activities over those years, it then does help. The outcome should be de-risking of that landscape in a lot of ways when it comes to that future deforestation that connected to their future supply. So there's a lot of potential in these JRED areas to serve as a way to, similar to like a jurisdictional certification type approach that like the RSPO experimented with years ago, to turn these commodity landscapes into a place that's low risk for that commodity and also benefit from governments and companies talking directly to each other to then create these benefit sharing things once they figure that out, of course.
Thanks, Leah, for the question. My answer hasn't changed since we last talked about it, but I think it's a great topic to discuss with the group here. I think using JRED within supply chains, and I'll talk about what I think the guardrail should be to have that happen. But I think it speaks to two of the things that we already discussed quite a bit today, which is one, not reinventing the wheel. Let's utilize what already exists and what has proven to work well. The other one is collaboration. JRED is very much a public-private, everybody needs to be involved kind of mechanism. So I see a lot of potential. Now, we know that there are some organizations that are trying to champion JRED as a way to also work on your within supply chain land to change emissions. And my thoughts on that would be that in very complex supply chains, and I'll give a few examples such as embedded soy, the soy that's within the meat or the chicken that you consume, palm derivatives, cattle byproducts such as the leftovers that is put into pet food. Traceability is becoming more and more a reality, but it is not yet a reality. And we want action on forests now. So if I need to choose between a company doing nothing right now because they cannot make a claim, or buying JRED credits while they still improve their traceability, I go for the second one. So I would say that in these complex supply chains, yes, I see a role for JRED credits, and I think that this is also being brought to SBTI and the Greenhouse Protocol to make that happen. But there need to be these guardrails, this process in place of how do we still ensuring continuous improvement. We can't let the ones that don't have the traceability completely off the hook, because that makes the ones that are the front runners, makes them worse off. So I would say yes, a role for JRED to address the land use change emissions, and there needs to be some kind of materiality. You can be buying a JRED credit for I don't know, like oranges if you're trying to address your soil land use change emissions, and it needs to be kind of in the same region if you have that information. But yeah, there needs to be this process in place to make sure that we keep moving the traceability dial.
Maybe just to close out that kind of question discussion, we've run into this where we work in Cote d'Ivoire, where we do agroforestry with cocoa farmers, and there's also an FCPF project in National Forest there. And so I think the governance element that was mentioned earlier is really important, just making sure that companies like mine that are implementers in the landscape are engaging with the government, that our client, who's a cocoa company, is engaging with the government, that there's clarity among the things being made, so that there's no double counting, and everybody, is well versed in what the other is doing, in agreement that it's the right thing in that landscape. A lot of questions.
Okay, so my name's Chris Newsom. I mostly work in southern Nigeria, in the big oil closest to, lucky enough to have an oil spill cleanup program where they can afford to do mangrove restoration right now. So I've got two parts. One, a big endorsement of listening to South-South. So although with the micro folks that got the resources, we're lucky they're led by a scientist, so they're very conscious of the science they're going to need to do to get mangroves sort of on the map for carbon credits. and it's less, for them it's less the cost and more the process and the complexity. For other groups in Nigeria, the thresholds are just way too high. There's projects that could be happening like 3 years ago if there wasn't that sort of entry level issue. I also want to pivot to Alan's side, because you mentioned Nigeria a couple of times, and cocoa. Does that mean, and apologies if it was earlier, does that mean you're in the southwest or the southeast of Nigeria, and how's that going?
Yes, we monitor all of Nigeria. So specifically, one of the main areas that we're working with companies and some of the NGOs with the Wildlife Conservation Society in Nigeria, actually. So it is in the whole Cross River area, but then also in like the dry forest areas in the west, the northwest. Yeah.
To your first question, really interesting. Thank you. I would say that in terms of what you mentioned on South-South collaboration, I'd love to connect you to some folks at Embrapa, because I'm sure that there's a handful of scientists that are working on science specifically to mangroves. I don't know if you took a boat around here. Sorry? Okay. Perfect. That's really great. So maybe from my point of view on the mangrove removals within supply chains, I would say that I'm not very knowledgeable about mangrove, but it's unlikely that there's soy or beef or palm production really close. Maybe palm is more relevant. If it's very close to your production, it's easier to have it come towards your within value chain mitigation, which builds a business case for companies to invest in it. But specifically in landscape initiatives, I think that's what we're trying to push for, that even if a mangrove is further away from your production, you can ensure that what you're doing there and the proxies that you get to with the science that you mentioned, that just can be counted towards company targets, and we can drive private investment into those areas.
I want to see the thought with you guys, which is that from hanging with these guys over the last year, and we've been surprised by the level of recovery. The place where there might be a supply chain link is actually in fisheries, because of particularly in Nigerian mangroves, anything that is good in fisheries in Nigeria is tiny mangroves. They're basically that's where everything goes to lay eggs, and also corn fisheries and so on.
Super interesting. I don't have much to add on the fisheries conversation, but
Yes, so no, very, very, very true. It doesn't just have to be these agricultural commodities. It's fisheries, maybe not here in Nigeria, but like the different hotel development, tourism sectors, like they obviously have a footprint there. I was the CEO of the Mangrove Breakthrough, Ignash, is somewhere around here. So happy to connect you with him to the Global Finance for Mangrove Restoration Initiative.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Segudo. I'm from Japan. So we're doing various carbon insetting projects with Japanese companies. So we have a project in Brazil, US, and Thailand, and Asia. So that's what we're doing. So we're doing a lot of insetting programs. So I was curious about how we measure the quality of those projects. So I think for the carbon credit, so we have a general consensus that ICDC and core carbon principle, we have some sort of credit quality measurement, general consensus about that. But I was wondering, how about in the case of carbon insetting, how are we going to measure in those quality? Is there any a consensus of which framework is going to use that? Or so that was maybe it's a basic question, but.
I can start. I think specifically, the short answer is no. But the word that I mentioned before on the high integrity setting, I think that's what we're trying to aim for. Exactly because we see a lack of these frameworks that can tell you if a project is delivering beyond just the carbon methodology to calculate what the carbon benefits are. I think that you also have VEHA and ISO working on inset project standards, so that's maybe a place to look. But honestly, from our side, we mainly focused on the SBTi changing protocol piece, and I think it's good to point out that they're not really going to the level of evaluating if a project is of high integrity or not. So that's something we're trying to address. But glad to hear from my colleagues if I said something wrong.
I can talk about what we do in our insetting projects. So I would say today it's a little bit client-driven in terms of the level of validation and verification that they want to pursue, just because the landscape is still a little bit of the Wild West. So with greenhouse gas protocol and renewables, they ask that you have third-party verification of outcomes, but it's not super prescriptive. And then certainly on the social and nature components, there's no kind of guidelines. So what we've done is we've taken some concepts in the insetting sphere that have kind of been widely shopped around. So like Value Change Initiative is a great organization that's been working on credible scope 3 claims, and kind of marry that with the widely accepted methodologies in the voluntary carbon market that exists. So you can think of like a VM47 for ARR projects, and then do sort of a matchup of those in order to quantify the carbon benefits, but then also make sure all of our interventions are meeting a minimum standard when it comes to things like ethics, stakeholder engagement, nature co-benefits, etc. And then we use an auditor. So because Kara has been doing this for 17 years, some of our projects did start out the voluntary carbon market that were directly designed with coffee companies, for instance, because that was what was available at the time. As we've moved into kind of the inventory landscape versus project-based accounting landscape for food and ag companies, that has evolved. And so today we're seeing a lot more interest in using VVBs, validation verification bodies, who maybe do work in the voluntary carbon market as well, but have also kind of adapted their offering to the scope 3 ecosystem and can validate our interventions against whatever set of requirements we say that we're applying. And does that kind of provide some insight?
Just really quickly, we want to learn within that initiative that I mentioned, Pure is on board, and exactly we need to understand what's happening within insetting project developers to understand what's the best practice that already exists and in what way can we make that also sectorially aligned.
I just wanted to comment on something that you said. I mean, lessons learned from the carbon market, I think is like definitely good input. In terms of ICVC and CCPs, I think that they are a great initiative to set the floor in terms of quality, carbon standards, governance, and methodology. But our experience is that actually quality really depends on each project. You have the same methodology being applied in different contexts, and you have like a very different rating. So when looking at methodologies and standards, I don't assume that because they are ICVC and CCP eligible are great, you can have actually really bad projects under those. So I think there's something important to keep in mind, but definitely it's a great inspiration, yeah.
Maybe just to quickly add on, in terms of the role of ratings agencies, we're actually starting to see interest from insetting clients in using Silvera, E0, etc., to do ratings on projects to provide that kind of extra level of assurance in terms of the carbon benefits being legitimate, and then also the co-benefits. So.
Yes, definitely. Maybe just like to comment super quickly on that. I think that's something that ratings are increasingly used for, is to kind of like come out with a list of remedial actions or advice. Not necessarily an example from the insetting world, but an example of how we are working with project developers at very early stage of the development of the activity, design stage, implementation stage. We are working hand in hand with them to actually tell them the things that they can improve. And I think that can be replicated for the insetting activities, and it's an area that we are starting to explore. So yeah, definitely.
Hello, also from Tokyo, Japan. So we are an agri-tech company specialized in global technology for biochar. We have some insetting projects as well with the coffee supply chain. And so one of the companies we work with in the coffee sector from Japan, so they were asking us, complaining how to involve the further downstream companies. So they buy coffee directly from the coffee farmers. So they sell in Japan, the beverage companies, people who actually roast the coffee, stuff like that. So one of the complaints they had is they wanted to involve further downstream companies into the insetting projects. So I was wondering if you have any experience with that.
Yes, actually we do. We will start a new project, but it's based on cattle. So I would say it's really difficult. So I understand their frustration. At Proforest, we often we look at ourselves as a bridge. We go where we see that there's a vacuum for action being implemented. We're starting a project with the Global Methane Hub. There's Super Pollutants Pavilion all the way exactly the opposite side of this pavilion. And basically we're starting some proof of concepts. What does that mean? We'll take a focal project, so a project that is already being implemented, that is monitoring the carbon benefits. There might already be an upstream actor involved. And we're going to help them exactly engage their buyers or downstream clients, and also help them with the methodological difficulties to set up that insetting project. And we're calling it proof of concepts because we really want to champion insetting as a way to promote supply chain collaboration to bring private climate investment to Brazil. So I'm glad to talk to you about the coffee piece. I do understand it as a bottleneck, and I know that Pure, for example, is also one of the companies that works towards finding the other links in the supply chain. Yes.
I also think there's a role for regulations in liquor. So with EUDR, for instance, for European companies, I think companies are figuring out their supply chain traceability better, and that's who the other actors within that supply chain are. And then kind of at a very basic level, I think one of the really interesting opportunities in the scope-free space is that you can co-claim those carbon offsets because they follow the commodity through the supply chain. And so that's a great way to engage with other tiers of the supply chain is by trading or selling assets to, upstream or downstream actors, depending, so that they can participate, co-finance, co-own, et cetera, those interventions.
Just to support Allison's comment, before my work at Satelligence did a lot of carbon commercialization agreements between companies, and for exactly that purpose, where once they've mapped, with like now with UDR as an impetus for getting more traceability data, is if you have good customer relationships, you then can come to them with this value proposition on investing or co-financing into these scope-free benefits. And if they have a climate target or they can see some materiality in that space, then almost all of them are interested in developing terms to figure that out.
Maybe just one thing. I guess I'm coming from looking at downstream companies that have the targets. We know that the distribution of flag targets specifically is still very much focused in the US and in Europe. Starting in Asia, Latin America, it's really very few if you look at the total amount of companies. So kind of what we're talking about here, it's a bit dependent on a company already having a net zero target. So if they do have a target, then that conversation is a lot easier. On the other side of things, we also need capacity building and awareness raising about SBTI and net zero in these producer regions, which is also something that we're starting to work on with Lacari, for example. Lacari is a Colombian initiative under Transforma, and they basically provide capacity building to financial institutions. And we really see there's some of the front runners that are ahead of the game and that are working on this, but there's also still a huge proportion of downstream companies in the global south that have not set the targets and that still need to raise the bar, basically.
Just to say really quickly, you said both for Japan, right? So I mean, many of the companies there see a huge spike in early adopters with TNFD, so the Task Force on Nature-related financial disclosures. So many of the Japanese companies are in the early to the biodiversity space, and then in their interface with nature. And so many of those companies can actually use that type of effort using the core benefit concept to when they're looking at understanding their interface with nature through the LEAP framework as part of TNFD, they can also then use that to understand better their scope 3 emissions, and that gives them even more reasons to invest in these scope 3 benefits with their upstream suppliers, because they can both invest in improving the outcomes for nature, they can invest in restoration, which also happens to have a scope 3 benefit, especially in the coffee space.
Other questions? Any other questions? Any other comments before we kind of sum things up? Okay, well, I'll take on the task of trying to kind of summarize some of the highlights of the discussion today. I don't know if any of you have been in an event where there was the rapper who came and did the summation, but that will not be me today. So I think we've heard a lot about kind of the uncertainty in the landscape and the need for clarity in order to have investment and clear demand signals continue into 2030 and well beyond. Computer is okay. And I think there's a couple of areas where we need that clarity to come from. One is in the MRV space, just having better access to data kind of across the board and real-time data, dashboards, et cetera, so that companies and investors know exactly what's happening on the ground. Another is clarity in the regulatory and voluntary commitment landscape as well. I mean, we've got the new SBTI corporate net zero draft that's come out. I haven't personally had a chance to read the whole thing, but I know that there's some interesting stuff in there. And then we've got regulations in Europe that have started to be rolled out and will continue to be rolled out in other places around the world as well. And then, as we also talked about, there's of course the jurisdictional RED Plus and Article 6 landscape happening in many of these countries at the same time. So how those things end up working together is going to be really important. And then also, I think in terms of driving landscape scale change, you've got to have interoperability between different types of assets, different income flows, et cetera. And so seeing that landscape really continue to develop in a way that it's easy for companies to make investments alongside potentially public financing and other types of private financing is really important. All with the goal of course, driving really positive outcomes for smallholder farmers, for other people living in those communities, for indigenous peoples, and for the natural environment. And I think some other things we talked about, of course, still there's ongoing debates about like the risk of reversals in nature-based solutions. I think it's clear that nature is a huge component of the solution here, but there are integrity challenges that continue to impede investment in NBS, and we've got to continue to work with those and how we're reacting to it, and also just methodological clarity to ensure that the carbon credits entering the market really do represent unit changes in carbon stocks. And yeah, maybe just to end, that data and transparency are really maybe the most key elements here, and I think we all know that, but there's of course the balance to play, as we talked about a little bit earlier, between data and transparency and MRV, and then also having the bulk of the finance going towards driving real impact outcomes. So with that, I will close. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining me today. I think this was a really good discussion. Hopefully you all enjoyed, and thank you to CDR 30 for letting us, have the space to have this chat here on Monday at COP. Happy second week, everybody.